Thank you. Thank you for being here. However you want to change the world, you need funding. But the good news is that the funding you need is all around us. In fact, I believe that by looking at problems differently and adding some creativity, there are essentially unlimited funding possibilities. So let me explain what I mean by telling you some short stories. The first story is about an important failure. The other four I've chosen because each one involves a different solution for seemingly impossible big problems. And none of them involve government funding or fundraising. So let me start with the failure, my failure. In 1979, I was becoming increasingly upset by the stories I was reading in the news about the Vietnamese boat people, refugees fleeing that country after that war because of terrible oppression. They were leaving behind everything they knew, crowding into leaky boats, setting out to sea, and in many cases being brutalized by pirates. I was also angry about this. I was angry at the United States. To me, this was a humanitarian issue, but it was also a matter of responsibility. The United States really wasn't doing very much for these people, at least at that time. And the more I thought about it, well, I came to a realization that before I complain about what other people should be doing, I really should look at myself. What was I doing about this? I was young, I was partway through law school, I had no career, no family, no mortgage. What was my excuse? So I decided that I would go to the refugee camps and work for a year. First I had to find the leading humanitarian organization that was already doing this. They were British, by the way, not American. I contacted them, explained my desire, answered some of their questions, and they very politely said, no thank you. So I discovered that my care and my commitment were a good start, but I really didn't have much more than that to offer. All I could do at the time, all I could think of to do at the time, was to try to raise awareness of the problem as a photojournalist. So I scraped together what money I could, I finagled a freelance assignment from a newspaper, and I went to the camps in Kowloon. These are just some of my favorite photos from being there. Every place I went, I was mobbed by children. It was really actually pretty enjoyable. Still in all, I had failed. My caring and concern alone were really not enough. So when I got back to law school, I put some time into thinking about this, and I realized that almost any social cause that any of us care about need funding. And that's what I focused on, finding ways to create new funding sources for the social causes that we care about. I call it nonlinear funding. And the key to understanding this, the stories will help, but whether you're conscious of it or not, there are revenue streams flowing around us all the time, every day. You can't necessarily see them, but they're there. And what I determined I needed to do was find a way for each of these causes to identify the right revenue streams and then create some way to bend some of that to the social cause that I cared about. I'm going to tell you 4 stories that I've worked on here. I've arranged them to start with the simplest one and then sort of move up in complexity and size as we go forward. The strategy in each case is the same, the solutions are different, but I think when you look at these collectively, you'll come to understand what I'm talking about. So let's start with story number 1. Story number 1, I was contacted by a small urban high school serving low-income families in another city. And they were doing remarkable work. They charged virtually no tuition, yet 100% of their graduates were accepted to college, 100% went to college, and 100% finished. I've never heard of that from another school. That was pretty remarkable. Now they were working in rented space, very crowded, and they had no assets. So they're essentially living hand to mouth with whatever they could raise each year to keep their doors open. And everybody loved them. They loved the outcomes. but the donors were getting fatigued. So what was the issue here? What was the challenge? This was to find financial sustainability, something long-term to support this school so that it continued to do its good work. To make it a little more difficult for me, the school said, you can't access any public sources of money. You can't raise tuition. That's kind of why we're here, is not to charge tuition. And our staff is already working very long hours, so you cannot assume that there will be any increase in the annual fundraising. Otherwise, can you help us? So here's the result. This is actually the solution. This is their new campus now. It's an 8-acre wooded campus, all new construction, designed just for the way they teach. And they have a multi-million-dollar endowment and new revenue streams. So how did we do this one? It's a campus, 2 buildings. You can see the academic building and the athletic building. And when I started this process with them, their big dream was to someday have a gymnasium of their own. This is their gymnasium, these are their students. But my strategy here was to actually come up with a campus that was better than what they were asking for. And what we put on the other side of the athletic building is an indoor soccer field. The only indoor soccer field in that city. These are their students using it during the day, but when they go home at the end of the school day, other people come in the evenings and weekends, other schools, clubs, not-for-profits, play lacrosse, soccer, whatever. And with those people who come to the campus, who are attracted to this campus, come the revenue streams, my green arrow, the revenue streams that work for the school. And those revenue streams are continuing, they come in every day. And as I told the school, this campus is going to be your biggest asset, and you really should look at it the same way you would an endowment. It should keep working for you after you've gone home at the end of the day. So that's what we did here. The strategy was to design something even better for the school and the students that would effectively import people and revenues. Story number 2. This is a current project. It's bigger, and I think it has more scalability. There are more places where this could work. In this case, I was contacted by an urban elementary school, a charter school, but they were housed in a very small, very overcrowded, worn-out, temporary building sitting in a parking lot. It was adding stress for the students as well as the faculty. And of course, the school had no money for a new facility. Making it a little more difficult, this is the neighborhood where this school is located. And in fact, so we have some difficult conditions, these images are of the site where the new campus is going to be. And I still remember going to this location at the beginning and standing there and turning around slowly and thinking, how am I going to do this? I can't imagine coming up with any way to attract people and revenue streams to this new campus, nice as it will be, until this community really lifts up and changes for the better. And I'll tell you at the outset here, I really didn't know what I was going to do, and that is normal when I start with these things. I never know where we're going to take it. But I started with the way I always start, and that is to get to know the students, the families and their goals for those students, the staff, the school, the community, the city that it's in. I try to gather up as much information as I can. I walk the neighborhood, I sit in the classrooms. Any information I can get is somehow going to help me find what I'm looking for. We couldn't import in this instance, so here's a quick sketch of the campus. The answer here is to export. This campus, which I think is about 7 acres of property, the circle in the middle is the school's kitchen. And so we will overbuild the kitchen. Indeed, it will obviously feed the students who are there and staff. But we're going to export to more affluent parts of that city. So that kitchen is also going to be selling food under contract to a sizable university elsewhere in the city. We also added some job training in the kitchen and a small bakery for the neighborhood. On the left, what you see there are greenhouses, a nursery, and a little bit you can see a small farm actually for these urban children. And again, we're going to export here. We're going to export plant materials to landscapers who work elsewhere in the city. selling all of this at the same price as everybody else. So we still have to deliver the quality on time, reliably, but we're going to export. And as we export those, in come the revenue streams for the school. So again, this was not really what the school had in mind, but they're very happy with the plan, and that's what we're going to do. You can see the campus here, and actually on the right are the classroom buildings laid out efficiently and securely. We added a few nice touches. There's a little Zen garden in there. There's a butterfly house, a gallery. It's going to be a very peaceful, secure environment. The kitchen, as you can see right in the middle of the screen, if you look closely, you'll also see the shipping dock there for our food sales and the entry to this small bakery that's there. And then on the left, you can see the nursery and even our little farm where the kids will be able to tend some raised beds. It's really going to be a wonderful environment. So, different solution, different situation. Story number 3. Story number 3, I was contacted by a group of educators who wanted to open a new, high-quality college prep high school in a low-income community in a large city. And they told me that they wanted it to be free. So I said, after 3 years here, let's start with what you've got. Why don't you share with me what you've got? I remember very ceremoniously they got up, and I'm pretty sure it was 2 pages. They had a neatly typed mission statement, and they handed this to me. Okay, this is where we're going to start. This is what you've got. And what it did is it reminded me, it went back to here's the caring, here's the commitment, what's missing? How are we going to solve this? So again, I set out to understand more of who these young people were, what their needs were, what their families' dreams for them were about, what the educators wanted to achieve here, local community, the city that they were in, etc. And what I concluded was that what these young people really needed, what all young people need, is more experience, more confidence, and more aspirations. And I also concluded that in this instance, we're not going to buy or build a new campus. I argued rather strenuously. We're going to rent some space inexpensively to get started. We have a lot of other things on our plate. I said, well, do you want to open this school in 5 years? Is this 10 years? When do you want to open the school? I remember these big grins. You know, we want to open the school next year. Okay. So what I ultimately decided was that what these students needed was more than just collecting academic credits. Most of them did not travel more than a couple of blocks from the neighborhood they grew up in. They needed that experience. So in my mind, I felt we needed to enhance the educational plan and to do it in a way that worked for the students but also fit the revenue needs of what we had to have for running the school. I can tell you that the next year we opened the school successfully. It's still there. And today there are 32 of these schools in the United States and quite a few more in the works on the way. Nationally, from all of those schools, their graduates, 99% of them are accepted to college. So what was my nonlinear solution here? I decided that what we would do is have the students in the classrooms 4 extended days a week. You still have to have the clock time to get those wonderful Carnegie units to get into college. But the other day of the week, every student goes and works an internship in a professional setting. Law firms, banks, corporate headquarters, entry-level positions, making copies, filing, is where people start. But what that does is it puts them in the adult world as participants. They're having adult responsibilities, adult conversations, adult relationships. That is really what makes the difference. Now to do this, we had to secure the business sponsors. So we ran, instead of a capital campaign, remember I'm not building a campus here, we had a jobs campaign. And we went around to the businesses and got pledges for entry-level positions a year in the future. And we had all of those locked up before the school opened. I'm going to show you now how it worked for one student at that first school. It's a short video clip, but I think it tells you how well this works.
Was it intimidating to you?
Very.
Senior Alex Macias remembers her first day on the job. Arriving at the looming corporate towers of downtown Chicago was the culture shock of her young life. What do you get out of this?
I think it's the experience. I mean, it's been the experience of a lifetime.
What does your resume look like already?
Oh, it's great. I mean, I'm going to graduate high school saying that I've worked at 4 different corporate offices.
For most of these kids, the idea that they could succeed at anything is a revelation. In these offices, they learn just how far they can go.
We're looked at as equals. You know, it surpasses that we're Hispanic. It surpasses that we're 16, 17, 14, and says, you know, here, go into the corporate world. You're destined to work in these big buildings, and who knows, maybe be the CEO of them one day.
Alexandra Macias.
10 years ago, the Chicago community had a dropout rate that soared as high as 75%. For the Cristo Rey class of 2004, the dropout rate is 1%. And every one of the students marching today has been accepted to college.
Baby, I love you. Thank you, congratulations.
Alex Macias was accepted to several colleges. Her choice was made easier by a phone call from Ohio's Xavier University.
You have been selected to receive one of our $15,000.
Oh my God! Are you serious? Thank you.
Alex graduated in the top 10 of her class.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
And the girl who had never been downtown before, who had missed only 1 day of work in 4 years,
Call my mom. Call your mom. Call your mom.
reaped her reward.
So I just talked to the Dean of Admissions from Xavier, and they're going to give me the $15,000 plus another presidential scholarship or something like that. Oh, don't cry. You make me cry.
All the rules, the work, the discipline came down to this.
You know, paid off. You said it pay off. We did it, Ma.
It's choked up every time I see it. I can never get past that. But it works. And it works pretty much that well for everybody who goes through this system. I really believe in this model. And now I have to show you the ugly chart. This is so you can understand how it works. Yeah, it's ugly. I'm sorry. First, I had to create the school as a 501c3, a tax exempt. So far, so good. And indeed, if donors want to give charitable contributions, they still make those to the school. We did decide that the families should pay some tuition, maybe $2,000 a year. But here, as you look at this, you can see it's a little unusual. Here's our nonlinear plan here. What I did next was create a subsidiary corporation of the school. And that corporation contracts with the law firms, the banks, the business sponsors to provide the services under contract. The subsidiary corporation also payrolls all of the student interns. Every student in that high school is a part-time employee on the payroll of that corporation, which maintains some control, some training, quality assurance, job performance. This is an educational experience. But for the businesses, there's no payrolling, there's no permitting, there's no paperwork. They just write a check, they pay for services, they get them. It's kind of an employer's dream here. To make it work for them, it was pretty important to guarantee for them that their work would actually get done and that it wouldn't cost them any more than if they had hired anybody else. Now, every one of these green arrows represents a revenue stream. And you'll notice no matter how they get there, they all wind up at the school. The program pays for the majority of what it costs to operate the school. A little bit of fundraising, a little bit of tuition, but the program does this. I believe it's a better result. These are, so far, all private schools across the country. Right now, I'm talking with some charter schools and even a public school district. They're very interested in adopting this model in their environments. Story 3.2, I'm going to slip this one in here. With the new charters in the public school district, we've enhanced it a little further. And we've said for any student who graduates from one of these high schools, goes on to college, and earns a college degree, they will qualify as beneficiaries of a private incentive trust that we're going to set up for just this purpose. It's totally self-funding. Again, there's no fundraising in this. But if one of those alums comes back and shows that they have a college degree, the trust fund will pay off up to $50,000 of their college debt. They can start their independent adult lives with little or no debt. And yes, this really will work. We won't get into it right now. My last story, number 4. We're getting more complicated and even bigger. And this is a current project. In this instance, I was approached by some philanthropists who focus a lot of their time and money on refugee issues. They wanted to know if I could come up with any new funding sources to support specifically education for children in emergencies and protracted crises. What does that mean? It could be a natural disaster, it could be an epidemic, but for the most part it's conflicts. It's human-made conflict. The data are a little bit imprecise. These are not places where you go out and do head counts easily, but it's roughly 65 million children that we're talking about. They're either the current sources of funding for those 65 million children for their education is primarily coming from the governments of the country where they're located. But as you can imagine, these are not wealthy countries. Not surprisingly, that funding is nowhere near what is needed for those children. The best estimate is that that funding gap is nearly $5 billion, and that's $5 billion every year. That's not a one-time thing, and it's likely to grow, and it could be higher. So what's our nonlinear challenge here? It is to find a totally new private source of funding that is not susceptible to politics and that is sustainable year after year. Where do you look for something like that? Well, this is the tip of story number 4. If you're going to look for a very large revenue stream, the best places to look are where extremely large revenue streams are already flowing. I'm optimistic that I found a way to get started on this. So we're working on it. Stay tuned. I'm working on it. But I really believe that we found a way to do this. We've been working on this for 2 years. So stories. I've given you some stories today. And to me, looking back at these, the funding solutions seem obvious. They seem to fit naturally. At the beginning, they weren't so obvious. These things take time. But what I have to tell you here today is that if you will look at problems differently and apply some creativity, what I call nonlinear funding, there are unlimited funding possibilities for really any problem.